I see we have several people joining. We're going to wait a few minutes to allow others to join us. So welcome and thank you for attending the webinar. We'll get started shortly. I see we've had a few more people join us. Thank you for joining the webinar today. We'll get started here in a few minutes. We want to give people a little bit more time to connect in. Thanks again. We'll start shortly.
Okay, Diane, it's 12:05.
Great. Okay, let's go ahead and get started then.
Well, hello and welcome to the webinar presentation about our commuter corridor study in Central Oklahoma. My name is John Johnson. I'm with the Association of Central Oklahoma Governments. We are always referred to as ACOG, ACOG. So both of those names apply to us. I appreciate you signing in today and taking your time. Hopefully we're going to be able to provide you some valuable information, and this will be a productive use of your time. We are the host agency for this commuter corridor study, and we have engaged the services of URS to consult and assist us in this study. And Diane Cowan is our project team leader for URS, and she's going to lead the presentation today. And she has a couple of her team members that she'll introduce for some of the information. So again, I just want to thank you for your interest and for signing up today. And hopefully at the end of the presentation, we'll be asking you to participate in a survey so you can provide some assistance to us in this process. Diane, would you like to begin?
Sure. Thank you very much for the introduction. And again, thanks to all of you for joining us today for the webinar for the Commuter Corridor Study, which we, as you can see in the upper right-hand corner of your PowerPoint, have now named Central OK Go. It's a little bit catchier name. As John Johnson mentioned, I will start and wrap up the webinar discussion, but we also have Ian Bryant from URS, who is the project team deputy project manager. He will be talking about the alignments, which I know everyone's excited to see. And then Brian Piasek, who's also from URS, he's one of our national transit professionals. He will be speaking about modes, so bus, rail, those sorts of modes that we might use for the different alignments. But before we get started, I did want to go ahead and just kind of do some of the general announcements in regard to the webinar. First off, you'll notice that you all are muted, and the reason for that is so that we can keep some of the background noise to a minimum so that you can then hear the webinar in full. We will be asking you to submit questions throughout the presentation. And to do that, if you look in the right-hand side of your window, you'll see a tab that says Notes. You can then click on the drop-down menu that says To, or Recipients, depending on your version. And you can choose All, Presenters, or particular individuals. Since we are recording this, both from a visual perspective and from an audio perspective, we would like for you to select All. Once you've selected All, there is a box that you can type your question in and then hit Send. We'll be answering questions towards the end of the presentation so that we can make sure we get through all the materials within the hour, and then we'll start answering questions. Hopefully all of you have been able to get onto the webinar without any issues, but if you are one who has been able to call in but is having problems with the actual viewing of the PowerPoint presentation or the webinar itself, you can call in to who we have standing for kind of some help on this is Ryan Baker, and his phone number is 405-234-2264. That again is 405-234-2264, extension 126. He should be able to help. Also, since this is being recorded, we will have the full audio and video of this available towards the end of this week or the beginning of next week for you to view at any time. All right. I think with that we can move on to the presentation. Okay, so why are we here? The corridor study is to determine the viability of high-capacity transit in the central Oklahoma region. The sponsors again are ACOG, as John Johnson mentioned, as well as the cities of Del City, Edmond, Midwest City, Moore, Norman, and Oklahoma City. The consultant team is led by URS with our sub-consultants, as you can see listed here on the slide. For this study, the Transit Dialogue, or RTD, is our steering committee. They are guiding our efforts, taking into account the technical work and public input. They will ultimately make the final study recommendations. The RTD was a recommendation from the 2005 Sixth Guideway Study and was initiated in 2009. It's made up of elected officials, policy stakeholders, private sector business leaders, and the general public. The RTD is working to define how transit can serve the central Oklahoma region. So what is the purpose of this study? It's to enhance regional mobility and provide transportation options in the central Oklahoma area. So what are we analyzing? 3 different corridor options that were identified in the region's 2005 Sixth Guideway Study. As you can see here, there is a corridor that goes from Edmond down into Oklahoma City, from Midwest City and Air Force Base down into Oklahoma City, and Norman and downtown Oklahoma City. The ultimate goal of the study is to generate what's called a locally preferred alternative for each corridor. So a locally preferred alternative, simply stated, is a transit solution for each corridor consisting of a line on the map, or an alignment, with a mode. So whether that's rail or bus, in many different forms, will be identified. To reach that goal of a locally preferred alternative, it is paramount that we get everyone's involvement. It is locally preferred alternative after all. We have established and are implementing a community and stakeholder outreach program that consists of work group meetings where we sit down with the attendees and actually do work, public open houses where we get information from the public as well as provide information about the study, newsletters where we report out about the study, and this webinar to get the word out, but more importantly to hear your thoughts. on the study itself and the different alignments and modes we'll discuss today. As John Johnson mentioned, we will ask you to fill out a survey after this webinar to gather some input, and we'll explain that a little bit more later. So what are the steps of a typical corridor study? Very simply, they're to identify, to screen, to detail, and to refine. So with public outreach, of course, throughout. So in the identify stage, you set the goals and objectives for the study. You gather data for existing conditions like population and employment and the existing transportation network. You look at major activity centers in the region, and you start to develop initial alternatives. In the screen process, you work with the work groups, the public, and through the public meetings and webinars, and the RTD to screen those initial alternatives you developed in the identify piece, resulting in recommended alternatives to move forward to the detail stage. In the detail stage, you perform lots of details. So you perform ridership modeling, you develop capital and operating costs for the different alternatives or alignments with modes, and then financial assessment to determine how can you pay for it. All this detail results in the refine stage, which is the ultimate goal of a final LPA for each corridor. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the review of study goals, objectives, and criteria that we used in the alignment analysis. We met with the RTD at the beginning of the project, and we asked them to think regionally and determine the overall study goals. So what they came up with through a collaborative process and then a voting process, they came up with an umbrella goal of enhanced quality of life. They felt that was very important for Central Oklahoma. The first goal was enhance regional connectivity and increase equitable access, support economic development and shape growth, provide a balanced and coordinated multimodal transportation system, and maximize regional participation. We then went out to the work groups, and each of these work groups was focused on a particular corridor. So as I mentioned before, there was 3 corridors, which we have dubbed the North Corridor for the one that goes out to Edmond, the East Corridor for the one that goes out to Tinker Air Force Base, and the South Corridor for the one that goes down to Norman. We then asked these work groups to think about the goals that the RTD laid out for the region and think specifically about their particular corridor, whether it be the north, the east, or the south. And add emphasis or identify any new goals that are important to their corridor or would be specific to their corridor. This is the results of that exercise. So it's just as an example, in the north, there was a high focus on the funding. So an additional goal has been added for funding under the north. Example for the east was they know that they have an existing rail right-of-way that's been somewhat abandoned. So they felt it was very important to make sure that there was either preservation or use of that existing freight corridor. For the south, there was a large focus on enhancing transit and land use together. So we utilized each of these from the north, east, and south work groups as specific corridors for their study in their specific corridor. So how did we use this information, really? And why do we set goals and objectives? Well, as demonstrated here, we can use them to guide the analysis of the alternatives or alignments by turning them into measurable criteria. we felt it was very important to make sure that when we asked for feedback or guidance from the RTD or the public, that we found a way to tangibly use the information. Therefore, we turned the goals and objectives into measurable criteria. So as an example, you can see the RTD goal of enhanced regional connectivity. There are several objectives that you can use to identify that goal. An example would be maximize connections between major activity centers. You'll see it highlighted by a circle in red. The criteria that we then determined from the objective of maximize connections between major activity centers is to actually count the number of activity centers along a particular alignment. A little bit more detail about that is how do we actually do it, is we determine within a half mile of each alignment the number of activity centers, and then we also went a little bit further and identified regionally significant activity centers, significant activity centers, and locally significant activity centers. Because every activity center is really not the same. For example, a regionally significant activity center could be either the Capitol, or Tinker Air Force Base, or the Thunder Stadium. But a locally significant activity center to that corridor, to that alignment, the people that live along it, might be a local shopping center. But that might not be a regionally significant activity center. All right, now I'll turn it over to Ian Bryant to talk about how we use that information to come up with the alignments and analyze them. Ian?
Thank you, Diane. As Diane mentioned, my name is Ian Bryant, and I'm going to go through our alignment analysis. Before we get started on that, I did want to mention that when I specifically mention the alignment analysis, what we're looking at here are the alignments or the routes or the lines on the map within a particular corridor. So this does not include mode. I'm not talking about whether it's a train or a bus here. We're specifically looking at just the alignment and the viability of that alignment. And then Brian will actually follow up after my portion of the presentation and discuss the mode piece. Okay, start it over. Let me get back on the slide here. Sorry about that. All right. So to start off, what's the purpose of the alignment identification process? Well, the purpose is to identify potential alignments for evaluation of high-capacity transit. So we're trying to find which alignments within each corridor make the most sense for a high-capacity transit investment. We had a specific methodology that we followed to identify these alignments. We reviewed various corridor-level maps and data. So we looked at things like population and employment densities. We looked at major activity centers. We identified those within each corridor. We also looked at things like limited mobility populations. So those are people who either don't own a car or low-income populations. We looked at existing transit ridership. So we looked at existing local bus ridership to give us an idea of where ridership currently exists. And then we also looked at the capacity of the existing transportation corridors. So based on this information, we then identified potential alignments within each corridor. We established the alignments for evaluation. It just so happened that we ended up with 7 alignments for analysis within each corridor. That wasn't a number we were shooting for, but we ended up with that in each corridor. And then we took this to the work groups within the individual corridors, and we had them give us some feedback as well. And we ended up revising some portions of the alignment based on the feedback of locals within that corridor. So this is the south corridor, and obviously you'll see it's on its side. So Oklahoma City, downtown Oklahoma City is on your left, and Norman's on your right. It's a little easier to see. We can zoom in more and see more detail with it on its side. So just keep in mind when you look at this that the north is on the left and the south is on the right. So what you see here are all 7 alignments that we evaluated within the south corridor. So each color is a separate alignment that we analyzed. In each corridor, you'll see we have the corridor or the alignments labeled S1 through S7 down in the legend. In each corridor, so S1, E1, and N1 are all the existing freight rail right-of-way, the alignment following that right-of-way. So keep that in mind as we go through this analysis. Let me go ahead and forward here. This is the result of our alignment analysis for the South Corridor. So we took this information to the RTD, and what you can see here is that really we have 3 alignments that have really come to the top. Each of these bars represent a separate alignment, and then you'll see for each bar there are separate colors. So for instance, if you look at S1 on the left, the blue represents the alignment's ability to enhance regional connectivity. So we looked at things like activity centers served, the ability to connect activity centers. We looked at limited mobility, so we looked at low income and zero car households. The red is support economic development and shape growth. So these are criteria within that goal that help us measure the ability to satisfy that goal. So for the red, we looked at things like population and employment densities. We looked at development and redevelopment potential. And then the green, which you see there, represents the ability to provide a balanced and coordinated multimodal system. And so from there, we looked at things, basically opportunities to connect with other modes. So for instance, how well does it connect to existing or planned hike and bike trails? How well does it connect to pedestrian facilities? And how would it connect to local bus, existing local bus service? So you'll see on S1 that there's also, on all of these, there's also a diamond that's at the top. What this represents is the total number of points that this alignment received for the analysis. So you'll see on S1 that the diamond is actually below the top of the bar. And the reason for that is that S1 actually scored a negative score, even though it was a slight negative score for providing a balanced and coordinated multimodal system. So basically we subtract out the negative points from the positive points. So the total number of points is actually less than the top of the bar. So in this corridor, we are actually, after talking with RTD and getting their input as well as the work groups, we're moving forward with alignments S1, S2, and S4. Those really came to the top. I'm going to go ahead and advance and show you those on the map here. S1 is the BNSF freight right-of-way. So you'll see that it comes out of downtown Oklahoma City on the left. All of these alignments start at the Santa Fe station in downtown Oklahoma City. They all travel through Moore and through Norman to the OU campus. So S1, as I mentioned, follows the existing freight right-of-way, the red line there. And then you'll see that S2 is the green line. It comes down Shields, and then it crosses over 35 and actually gets onto the BNSF right-of-way and takes that into downtown Norman and OU. And then S4 is the blue. It also comes down Shields and then actually gets on the 35 and takes that to Flood over to Porter and then to downtown Norman and OU. And I also want to point out here that after taking these to the work groups, we did get some feedback, so we made some changes to these alignments. So they were for S4, again, the blue line. This originally, we had it going down to Lindsay. After we got feedback from the work groups, it was determined that it made more sense, actually, to take it over to Porter and to avoid Lindsay altogether into downtown Norman and OU. We also were told by the South Work Group that they thought we should extend all of these recommended alignments to Highway 9. So you'll see where my cursor is there that we've extended each of these alignments down to Highway 9. So those were the major changes that came out of presenting these to the work groups in the South Corridor. So now we'll take a look at the East Corridor. Again, these are all 7 alignments that were analyzed for this analysis. You'll see that we looked at alignments that parallel I-40. We also looked at alignments that are both north of I-40 and south of I-40. All of the alignments start in downtown Oklahoma City at the Santa Fe station, again, just like the South Corridor. They travel through Del City and Midwest City, eventually ending at Tinker Air Force Base. One thing to point out here that Diane touched on earlier was that one of the unique aspects of the East Corridor is we do have a segment of the abandoned freight right-of-way. So if you see where my cursor is, this is the existing UP right-of-way. There's active freight on that portion. But on this piece here, that starts right here at this intersection, goes down to Tinker, that's actually the abandoned rail right-of-way. So that's an opportunity where we have the existing right-of-way where we could put a project, and this actually doesn't exist within the other corridors. So it's very unique to the East Corridor. So here are the results of the analysis in the East Corridor. You'll see that there's two that really jump to the top, E5 and E6. If you see the red portion of the bar there, you'll see that E6 really does a good job of supporting economic development and shaping growth. So E6 really hits the areas of the cities that have the highest population and employment densities and also have good development and redevelopment potential. And also E6 and E5 both score well in terms of enhancing regional connectivity. So these both do a good job of accessing the major activity centers within the region, and they also provide good access for limited mobility populations. So working with the RTD, after we got their feedback, it was determined that E1, as you see here on the left, did not score as well. It was actually one of our negative scores. However, they felt that it was too early to eliminate the freight right-of-way alternative in all of these corridors. So you'll see in the south, the east, and the north, the N1, S1, and E1, the freight right-of-way alignments, were all carried forward to detailed analysis. So for the East Corridor, the recommended alignments for detailed analysis are E1, E5, and E6. So we'll take a look at those now. So you'll see E1, it follows the existing UP right-of-way. So it shares this portion with active freight. And then it gets onto the abandoned rail right-of-way through Midwest City and ending at Tinker Air Force Base over by the town center. E5 and E6 both actually use the 8th and 10th corridor, so it goes through the health sciences area. E5 then actually cuts over onto the abandoned right-of-way down to Tinker, whereas E6 continues along 10th, goes down to Air Depot through the heart of Midwest City, across front of the town center, and ending again at Tinker Air Force Base. So these are the three alignments that we're carrying forward in the East Corridor for detailed analysis. Now we'll take a look at the North Corridor. Again, there were 7 alignments that we analyzed. As you can see, we have some that parallel the 235 and Broadway Extension Corridor. We also have some on the eastern side of 235 and left of 235. Again, keep in mind this map is on its side. So downtown Oklahoma City is on your right, and downtown Edmond is on your left. So we took these alignments, we did the analysis, and then we Regional Transit Dialogue. They're our steering committee for this project. We took this analysis that you see here to them. This analysis, obviously, we had some more positive scores here. So the two that obviously come out on top here that you can see are N2 and N3. They both scored very well in terms of regional connectivity, multimodal system, providing a multimodal system, and also supporting economic development. Again, we also, at the request of RTD, we're carrying forward N1 as well, which is the existing freight right-of-way alignment. So we'll be bringing forward N1, N2, N3, and then actually, at RTD's request, we're also going to take a look at N7 in more detail. As you can see, N7, the blue portion there is enhancing regional connectivity, and that N7 scored the highest in terms of connecting regional connectivity. So what that means is it really does a good job of connecting activity centers and providing access to limited mobility populations. N7, as you'll see on the next slide, is on the eastern side of 235 as well. So they wanted to carry forward an alignment, obviously, that follows the existing freight right-of-way, as well as a couple on the west and one on the east, just to see how they perform in detailed analysis. So here's a map showing the 4 alignments that we're carrying forward to detailed analysis. Again, N1 follows the existing BNSF right-of-way from downtown Oklahoma City up to downtown Edmond. N2 and N3 both come out of downtown, go in front of the existing transit center, and then both go up Classen, around the Classen curve by Chesapeake Energy, and then they actually diverge here at the existing BNSF right-of-way. So N2, which is the green alignment, then gets onto the BNSF and takes that into downtown Edmond. Whereas N3, the orange alignment that you see here, follows the old interurban right-of-way, cuts over east at Hefner, and then gets on to the Broadway extension into downtown Edmond. And then finally, N7, as I mentioned, is our eastern alignment that we'll be looking at in detailed analysis. That's the purple alignment. You see it goes through health sciences, go across 23rd to Eastern and MLK, and up to Edmond. A couple things to point out here in terms of changes after we worked with the work groups is with the orange alignment, N3, you'll see here that we go directly on to the Broadway extension from Hefner. The original alignment we had went over to Kelly, but after talking with the North work group, they felt it made more sense to go ahead and get onto the Broadway extension into downtown Edmond. And then the other major change was with N7, the eastern alignment here. We took this actually directly through the heart of the health sciences, and then instead of going up to 36, we cut over on 23rd up to Eastern and MLK. So it serves the health sciences, it serves the Capitol, it serves the Adventure District, and then obviously downtown Edmond and downtown Oklahoma City. So these are the four alignments that we're carrying forward into detailed analysis for the North Corridor. And then finally, this map basically shows all of these corridors together. And the purpose of this map is to say that we're looking at obviously movements within each corridor and how these alignments would serve those corridors. But we also understand that really we're talking a regional system here at some point. So we need to look at not only intra-corridor, but intra and inter-corridor movements. So for instance, we need to see, and we will be able to see, how many people would be interested in going from Moore, where they live, to, say, Tinker Air Force Base. So we can look at through movements as well as movements within each corridor. So that's very important as we get into the detailed analysis and the modeling portion of this project. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Brian Piasek, and he's going to step you through the modal analysis. Brian?
Thank you, Ian. This is Brian Piasek. I'm also with URS. I'm going to talk a little bit about the modal piece of this and how the different modes excuse me for a second. I'm trying to assume control here. Okay, here we go. And like Ian, it started over for me, so bear with me. Yep. First thing we looked at, as these different alignments go into detailed evaluation, we need to make some assumptions on what modes of transit will work best on them giving their characteristics, and I'll try to point some of those out when we take another look at the map. But the first thing I wanted to do is just kind of give everyone a quick primer on the different modes that we still are assessing. The first one on this sheet is a commuter rail. That is also known as heavy rail, not to be confused with some people who think of heavy rail as like New York City third rail providing the electricity, really high density types of transit. This is more serving suburban areas with major employment centers near or close by the center of town. So these are either what we call diesel multiple units, which are essentially self-propelled passenger cars, or a locomotive that would pull passenger cars along behind it. This type of mode is typically used in peak hour operation predominantly. So you'll see quite a bit of service during the morning and evening rush hours, with some trips made during midday and off-peak to facilitate additional trips. Can generally handle 400 to 1,400 passengers per hour, depending on the train, how many cars on the train. Diesel multiple units can also be paired together. So if we're using that technology and we need more capacity, we can certainly lengthen the train consists based on demand. Stations are typically spread out. These types of operations are built for minimizing travel time to try to get from one end of the corridor to the other as quickly as possible. So you really don't want it stopping very much. The typical commuter is going to be willing to drive to a station, or we will support these types of operations with some feeder bus service. But the typical rider is parking and riding at some of the suburban stations and then riding into their destination, closer to the center of town. We are also looking at light rail, which is typically a higher capacity, shorter haul type of technology. These rail vehicles are called light rail because they cannot be operated on the same tracks with heavy rail vehicles. They do not have the crashworthiness required to do so. So they're typically used for shorter type of corridors, 10 to 15 miles max. Can certainly handle quite a few more passengers and are really used for corridors that support what we call intra-corridor trips. So if we get a lot of passengers that want to go from, only want to ride a few stations, or there's a lot of activity within the corridor, then light rail will tend to be the better choice for mode. Stations are closer together, although they can be further apart depending on the aspects of the corridor. We're also looking at bus rapid transit, which is a rubber tire technology. Doesn't quite have the capacity of light rail, but it does offer quite a bit of flexibility in terms of actually having feeder buses, which might feed a light rail station, can actually get onto the BRT and provide service along the BRT as well. So you get a little bit more or less transferring between vehicles and can actually minimize travel time that way. We are also considering streetcar, which would really be a combination of light rail and bus rapid transit. Typically, streetcars they're essentially constructed very similarly to light rail. However, they're smaller vehicles and can actually operate within traffic. Or you can give them their own right-of-way, and they act very much like a light rail. So if we get through our analysis and see that we have a lot of intra-corridor trips, but we don't need the capacity of light rail, then streetcar can be a very viable option. The other reason for using streetcar is it can hop off of a major corridor and actually serve transit centers that might not be right on our alignment, similar to what a bus could do. Obviously, we still need to build in the infrastructure in order to support that. The other reason why we're considering streetcar is that there is precedence in the region to look at streetcars in the downtown area, and that alignment in downtown actually lends itself to the north corridor. So we could essentially tack on to the downtown alignment and move vehicles north along the northern alignment. Express bus is also on here, and we're not really considering that as a mode, but it's on here primarily because it can be an interim service. I think, or it can also be a support. I mean, if we were to do light rail or streetcar that might not have the travel times that commuter rail gives us, we might augment that service with express buses in the corridor in order to provide a one-seat ride from end to end. So it's there just to give us flexibility and lend support to our operating plans. So if we could take a quick look at the corridors themselves, as Ian mentioned, the N1 or the first corridors, the actual rail lines that we're pulling forward, will all be assessed with using commuter rail. So we're looking at the south corridor. Again, these are this is on sideways. So Norman is on your right. Norman is on your right, and Oklahoma City is on your left. The line in red, we're assuming, would have commuter rail service on it, and we will compare that to BRT, light rail, and streetcar, bus rapid transit, light rail, and streetcar on the other two corridors, with one exception. The blue line here, the S4, we're probably not going to consider any rail options on that because we don't really have the space on I-35 in this middle section in order to pull that off. So that will probably be solely bus, but the other two will be looking at rail options. In the east corridor, we have this nice abandoned rail line here in the western or the eastern part of the corridor, and really not precluding any of the mode alternatives on the red alignment. So we'll look at a commuter rail line that will utilize the whole red alignment, and then E5 and E5 actually utilizes the abandoned rail line, and then either goes up to 10th Street and serves the southern end of the health center and down into downtown. We'll look at all three modes on that particular corridor, and then look at bus and streetcar on E6. So with that, I will turn it back over to, North Line, forgive me. North Line, we have 4 alignment alternatives. As I mentioned, N1 will be a commuter rail corridor. N2 and N3 will look at streetcar and BRT and light rail. As I mentioned, the streetcar corridor in downtown ends in this area here near 10th and Classen. And then we'll be looking at streetcar and bus rapid transit on N7. Probably will not look at light rail on this corridor, primarily because we would need our own alignment along Eastern and MLK Boulevard, and really getting through the government center, it will be difficult for any rail alternative. So we'll stick with streetcar on that one. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Diane.
Thank you, Brian. All right, so now you know the alignments and the modes being recommended to move into detail analysis. We'll be asking, again, your thoughts on them through the online survey that we'll be sending out information to your email after the webinar. But first, let me quickly review what tasks are complete. We have completed the identify and screen steps. As you can see, they're highlighted in color on the image of the box that say identify, screen, detail, and refine with the arrow underneath it. So those have been completed. Under identify, we have worked with the RTD and the work groups to identify goals and objectives, as I talked about earlier, and identified the existing conditions. Under screen, we've worked with the work groups, RTD, and the public to identify the alignment and mode to move forward into the detail study. This is where, again, we need your input through the online survey to finish up this step. Oh, sorry, excuse me. There we go. So what's next? We're heading into the bulk of the technical detail analysis. So as I said before, the details, if you will. Once complete, we will present the results of the detail analysis and a technical solution for the LPA in each corridor, or locally preferred alternative in each corridor, for the work groups, the public, to provide feedback on. And this feedback and the technical results of the analysis will be considered by the RTD for their recommendation of a locally preferred alternative in each corridor. We will continue to provide updates on progress on the Central OKGo website listed here, centralokgo.org. So check back often for changes and updates. And we need your input. If I haven't said it enough already, we'll need you to complete the survey. Here is a link to the survey at www.surveymonkey.com/s/CentralOKGo. It's a little cumbersome to write down, so we will be sending you an email that has this information in it. Oops, and I think Ian drew on top of the PowerPoint. But no worry, he's also sent everybody a note with the actual link, so you can copy, if you can see the note, you can actually copy the text that has the link, and you can go to the survey. Also, please visit our project website and sign up for our mailing list. That way you can stay current on the project updates as well. Tell your friends, family, and coworkers about the project itself and also about the webinar. As I mentioned, towards the end of this week, beginning of next week, we will have this webinar available online for you to watch. Stay engaged and help us plan for high-capacity transit in Central Oklahoma. So at this point, I'm going to ask Nancy to go ahead and mute everyone again, since I know we've had several people join. And then again, how we do this is on the right-hand side of your screen, you have an area called Notes. To send in a question, if you have any, you can go to the To, or Recipients, drop-down menu, select All. In the box below it, you can type your question and then hit Send. The question will then pop up in everyone's screen to see, and we will answer your questions. If you have no questions, you're more than welcome to drop off and get back to your day, and I do want to thank you for joining us if you do drop off. Otherwise, please let the questions roll in. Okay, it looks like we got a question on, will there be adequate parking at all stops for commuter cars? Typically, the way that that's determined is that an analysis is done to determine how much parking is required based on how many people are anticipated to ride a particular high-capacity transit investment. So an analysis would be done, and parking would be implemented to fit that, typically. Now, of course, sometimes cost comes into play on the project, and parking might be smaller than what the model might say. However, we always typically tend to recommend larger parking lots, because once the investment is up and running from a rail perspective, typically those parking lots do fill up. Brian, I don't know if you have anything else to add to that, or if you want to answer the next question, which is, did the analysis determine the cost of right-of-way for these corridors that had a light rail option?
I'll try to do both quickly. Typically, the more suburban stations will definitely have more parking than the ones that might be closer into town. Obviously, because that's where most people are using their cars from suburban origins to get into town. So those stations will typically have more parking. The question regarding cost of right-of-way, that is definitely going to be something that we will look at. And it's not just for the light rail options. I mean, we're assuming our bus options will have quite a bit of infrastructure in order to get the buses out of traffic. So yes, we will, in our analysis, detailed analysis, each alternative will be, given an order of magnitude cost based on all of those factors: infrastructure, right of way, operations, everything.
Great, thanks, Brian. Okay, the next question, which Brian, you might want to answer this one as well. Will part of the analysis include considering BRT routes to suburban rail stops?
All of our alternatives will be in, we do a travel demand modeling exercise in order to forecast ridership for each of these alternatives. And that ridership will be based on an operating plan that includes feeder bus routes into the stations so that we're not completely dependent on people driving to these stations. So yes, there will be bus routes serving all of the stations on our corridors.
Great, thank you. Any more questions? I know there has to be a few more. Well, we got a comment of thank you and looking forward to sharing the recording with friends. Well, we appreciate that. And ACOG wants to let everyone know that the follow-up email with the direct survey link will be sent in a few minutes. And then we have a question of, and of course, all modes are accessible for people with disabilities.
Yes, ma'am.
I like that resounding yes, ma'am. Okay, we have a question on service to the airport. Ian, would you like to answer that one?
Sure. Am I unmuted here? Okay.
Yep.
Based on the 2005 fixed guideway study, there actually was the results of that study recommended these three corridors in the north, east, and the south for this next stage of analysis. So our charge here with Central ACOG is actually to look at those three corridors. That being said, and Brian, correct me if I'm wrong here on any of this, but we will be looking at a connection in the west corridor. So as we do the modeling, we will have our routes that we've shown you here and the modes within these three corridors. We'll be looking at regional movements between those corridors, and we'll actually be adding a link west to see what kind of movements we would get to and from the west as well. Is that correct, Brian?
Yeah, I mean, I would just add that, Ian, you mentioned it earlier, that we are looking at these corridors as part of a system. So addressing travel issues in the west, even though those might not be first to go, west and southwest, and we've got to look at ways to try to serve that and make sure that we're developing, long term, we're developing a system that serves central Oklahoma adequately. So an airport will play a large role in that.
Thank you, Brian and Ian. Okay, it looks like we've got just a few more minutes if there's any other questions. All right, I don't see any other questions coming in. So again, I just want to say thank you for attending the Commuter Corridor Study Central OK-Go webinar today. And again, we will have this available on the website for you to tell all your friends about and for you to revisit as well in case you want to listen or look at some of the slides while you're answering your survey. Again, your survey will be the link to it will be emailed to you here shortly. With that, we will sign off, and thank you very much for your attendance.